Okay, this class we will be divided again in three main sections. Again, we're going to have to take three quizzes online. This time we're only going to have one attempt. Then we will move to the next section of the class that I will explain those online quizzes that we just took. And finally, at the end, we will break into groups. And in the class discussion, we will talk about selective breeding. So in this section of the class, you're supposed to take your quiz. So if you are already in class, the time of class, please go and take your quiz. And remember, there are three main sections that you're supposed to read. So you're supposed to take this quiz that say Greek philosophers, this one say selective breeding, and this one that is the section of Aristotle. So Greek philosophers and selective breeding. Okay, now that we're done with this one, now I'm going to explain the answer of those quizzes. Okay, so question for today, we're going to talk about what is selective breeding, and we're going to talk about the past, the present, and the future of selective breeding. And I'm going to we use some video lectures that talk about that, and I'm going to give you a few examples that we'll have in the in-class discussion so you understand that the selective breeding actually is still taking place and how it's affecting your life. So I'm sure that you know that the first quiz that you have to answer was this one from this video that talk about the history through the eyes of a chicken, how selective breeding has affected the anatomy of the chickens. Okay, and to start that, maybe you remember this, in the video they show that there is a huge diversity of shapes, of color of the feathers, of diversity in general of different chickens. And this is fantastic, although we only know very characteristic type of a chicken. There is actually a huge diversity, and that was a very important idea that it will be fundamental for Darwin. So let's start the quiz. So the first question that that they talk in that video is, you know, what is the part of the word that that is the naming range of the first group of chickens that they were artificially selected, and they give you these options: Southeast Asia, Egypt, Europe, or China. So the answer will be this one, as you watch in the video. This will be the answer. And maybe you remember that because of the process of colonization, so these breeds that they were in the southeast of Asia, in this section, they were brought to England. And so as they show here, with these lines, and they call this the hen fever because they were able to mix to breed so many traits and so many different species, and in that way they were able to get the traits that they were looking to. If they were looking for species that they look different with the specific feathers, so they were able to get it. If they were species they were looking for more meat, so they were able to get the species with more meat. So that was something that it was very interesting, and they discussed in the video. Second question: why do smaller chickens uh, make more meat and eggs than earlier chickens? And here you have all the options, and the answer is D. As we discussed in the video, selective breeding, artificial selection has played a key role, although it's possible to add genes from any species, even for example from frogs, into the DNA of the chicken. Right now we have the techniques. This is not the main reason why they produce more meat and more eggs. The main reason right now is this one. And why, and also although we can add hormones, and also they play a key role. Right now, actually, the main reason still is this. So the main reason of all this, it will be selective breeding right now. Okay, now this question: which of the following reasons explain why scientists believe that chickens were domesticated? So they give you all these options, and they talk they talk in the video that they were used for fighting. And you can see the video. In the video, this picture that they talk that they were used for fighting. So it's fascinating. In the beginning, they were not used for to collect the eggs or for meat or for any type of for eat for the leather for the feathers. It's just fascinating how this was not the main reason. It was just mainly for entertainment, for fighting. And now let's try to answer this question. Why are chickens a good species to help us to study genetics? And if you remember, we studied last time what it was a model organism. So in this case, the answer will be all these options. So if you remember, chickens take only 7 months between generations. And on the other hand, for example, humans will take years. So these 7 months is a short, is a more or less rapid generation. It's not as small like fruit flies that they will take. It will be like 2 weeks for a new generation. And yeast. If you remember that we talked last time of yeast, that it will be every 8 hours. So these ones are even breed faster. But for example, yeast is not as close to humans as chicken, and so chicken have some advantage. Also, chicken has a wide variety of traits. So this is a reason why it's a good system to study genetics, because you can study, for example, the coloration, the feathers. So there are many ways to study that, and they have a high genetic diversity. As we studied, this is why it was so interesting for Darwin to study all those. So the answer here, it will be all these options, D. And uh, later we will study that in fruit flies we also have a variety of traits. So here, for example, you can see that while the normal flies have these flat wings, we can have mutants that can have curly wings. If you see, we will study how it was very important to study coloration of the eye. This is why we know that the genes are on the chromosomes. And we can have also other colorations in the wings, in the body. Again, here you can produce orange eyes, and there is a huge amount of variations and mutations that they are very important to study genetics. So this is why both fruit flies and also in this case chickens, both are good systems to study genetics. And there are many other organisms that are good to study biology, and they are called model organisms. And here, as we talked last time, we have, for example, yeast, worm, fruit flies, fish, mouse, and all of them are good. Here you can see some examples, and as we saw in the last class, you have an example of they have a normal name, and this is the scientific name underneath. So here is the scientific yeast, and the scientific name is Saccharomyces cerevisiae. As we studied last time, here is the normal name, and here, as we studied last time, the scientific name, that is Drosophila melanogaster. And they are good to study because they provide experimental systems that yield insight into human biology and health, because as we say, they can breed fast, they are small, so you can have them in the lab. And they have been studied in a lot of detail. So for example, we have the genome, all the genes of the fruit flies. We have all the genes. They have been sequenced of all these organisms. We can also sequence all the protein. We know all the proteins that they have. And now they are starting to study how they interact, for example, in fruit flies, and also in these worms that are called C. elegans. So why they are model organisms? Because they are easy to breed, because they are easy to manipulate in the lab, as we said last time, and because we have studied them in a lot of detail, so we can use them and have answer questions very fast. Okay, now let's go for this question. Why were chickens influencing for this very important person, Charles Darwin's development of the theory of evolution. Here you have four potential answers, and the answer will be D. And why? Because Darwin thought if human can breed so many type of chicken and have so many different traits, then nature can do something similar. So this is why. C is not correct because Chinese chicken adapt to their new environment, European environment. Actually, Darwin wasn't talking exactly about that. Darwin was talking about that there is variation and they can adapt to new environments and the ones that are better adapted are the ones that survive. So this is not exactly the best answer. Chickens are one of the oldest species, thus is not that there is no relationship, and chickens make rapid changes between generations. This is not exactly what Darwin said. So the best answer is this one, because as he saw that there were so many different type of chicken, there was so much variation. If you breed them, they will be a chicken that can have the best traits to survive in a specific environment. And if you have any doubt, you can go and see the video, and they have this crazy picture of Darwin that he saw that, for example, chickens have so many different traits. So one of them, for example, it could produce beneficial phenotypic changes that could allow him to adapt to an environment. So imagine that there is a Canadian chicken that needs to be white, so because it can hide in the snow. So he was able to see, okay, if they can produce all these colors, and then he saw finally one that it was a white chicken. So like maybe that will be beneficial, and he can live and hide in Canada in the snow. So it would be very easy. So this was just an example, and he found many. You can think about many different hypotheses. And then we talk about the Greek philosophers, and we talk about Pythagoras, if you remember, and we also talk about Hippocrates. So let's solve the questions of the quiz. So first one, Hippocrates used the following model organism. If you remember, the best answer here will be none of these options, because at this time the Greek philosophers, they didn't they didn't conduct experiments, so they didn't have they didn't use model organisms. So chicken eggs was used, if you remember later in the videos, for Aristotle. He was the first one who started conducting experiments. Rabbits, we will talk about this guy. He's the cousin of Darwin, and he was the founder of something that we study later, eugenics, and he used rabbits. And as we said before, Darwin used chicken. So there are every different scientist, depending on the question that they have, they use a different model organism. However, Hippocrates, this is the beginning, he didn't use any model organism. He didn't conduct experiments. The only thing that he proposed was hypothesis. So this question is very easy. And if you remember this guy, he was in love of geometry. And if you remember, you study maybe this triangle in high school, and you remember that this is called hypotenuse, and you remember the opposite and the adjacent sides and all the things. Remember that that was an idea from Pythagoras, and he tried to apply that to inheritance. So he thought that the mother and the father were what? So you have to remember the mother and the father were here, and the child was the third biological of the parents of the two lines. So it's very easy if you read the readings that I posted on Moodle. So the answer was D. And let me explain it. Here you have this triangle that is very famous, and here you have these different sides. So he thought that inheritance can be explained in this way. The parents were in each side, and the kid will be the interaction of both. So remember, This one was here and here. And you can go back, and I explain this in a little bit in more detail, but in the video lecture I talk about the ideas of Pythagoras and how he believed that the male is in charge of supplying all the nature while the female is in charge of the nurture, and that heredity was a strict mathematical formula. And if you have any doubt in the video lectures, you can see that in more detail. Okay, this question is very easy. So the people who consider that Pythagoras was right argue that heredity was harmony at work. So it was and we just saw it, so it was a triangular harmony at work. So it was not only geometrical, it was a triangular, and they didn't know anything about genetic. Likeness is not exactly what he talked about, and so none of those options. So triangle is the right answer. And this is an additional question in case that you have more questions. Now I want that you stop the video and read this question. Okay, and the answer, if you remember this idea of the mystical vapors, that idea comes from Pythagoras. We didn't talk about Plato, we talked about Aristotle, but he was against this idea, and Hippocrates it was talking about something else. If you remember, it's the pangenesis. So this is a completely different idea. And if you remember, he believed in these mystical vapors that the parents, the male, send it to, are transferred from the dad to the kid. So remember, they were in the semen of the male. And if you have any question, you can go to this part of the video lecture that I talk about how the vapors were very important for Pythagoras, and very important this concept of likeness. So remember that the male semen bring this likeness while the female only have the nutrition, and I give all that information. Okay, let's go to an additional question that is also very easy. I'm sure that you will be able to answer this question. It's very similar to a previous one that we studied. And the answer is very easy. So remember, we are talking about Pythagoras, and both Pythagoras and Hippocrates. And Hippocrates, they didn't do experiments. So while Aristotle studied the egg development, and as we said, the rabbits were used by Galton, the cousin of Darwin, and Darwin used chicken. Pythagoras didn't use any of those. He didn't use any model organisms. Okay, now let's go and answer the questions about Aristotle. So Aristotle rejects the notion that heredity was carried exclusively in. Okay, so let's answer this question. So in the male sperm. So if you remember, something that is characteristic of Hippocrates and of Pythagoras is that both consider that the male semen was the most important component in inheritance, and uh, Aristotle thought something different. So if you have any doubt, you can go to the video lecture. I just want to remind you that Aristotle have a very different opinion of how inheritance occur. So he has a strikingly radical opinion, and for him there was a mutual contribution between males and females, while the males, for him, this resemble the process like when you plant any seed. So the male produces the seed, while the female produces the raw materials. So the male has the architectural plan of the building, while the female it was in charge of the construction material. So again, they was completely different to the previous ideas, because for him there was a mutual contribution. Okay, now let's try to answer this question. Aristotle offered an alternative theory that was strikingly radical at this time. We just answered that question. So it's very easy. Perhaps females, like males, contribute to the actual materials of the fetus. So as we just said, there was a mutual contribution that we just talked about it. So all the other ones, only males contribute to the material of the fetus. Is the opposite. Only females contribute to the actual materials of the fetus. This is right, but is not this is not the best question. Is the best question will be this one. None of these options wrong. And mystical body vapors. This is an idea of a different Greek philosopher. So this is wrong. And if you have any question, we just saw that, and here you can find the answer. Again, this question comes from the readings that I gave you. So Aristotle called the male contribution A. So these are the options. And if you go to your reading, you can answer these very easily. So it was called principle of movement. Here it is. If you go to your read, Aristotle called the male contribution a principle of movement. And in the video lecture, I talk a little bit about. Okay, and maybe if you remember, I showed this video in the video lecture, and the idea is that Aristotle thought about this principle of movement because he studied the morphogenesis of the egg embryo, and he thought that instead of being a static process, that the chicken was only not it was not only growing, it was he saw many things happening at the same time and many changes. So all the things that you're seeing here and that are there is a schematic of all the changes that are happening. So this is why he thought that there was movement. Yeah, there was in the way that it was a dynamic process instead of being something that it was static, rather than just growing from a tiny chicken and become bigger and bigger. So he was opposed to that because he was able to see, to perform experiments, that was the key component of the theory of Aristotle that made him so different from all the Greek philosophers in terms of inheritance. Okay, now I'm going to give you an extra question in case that you want to study more. According to Aristotle, female semen in contrast contribute to what? For the fetuses, so and we studied just that. We studied so it contributes to the physical raw material, and we just studied that a few seconds ago. And if you go to the video lecture, you can see that is here.